I want to welcome our next speaker on stage again. He's been here already yesterday, so I've already said a lot of the things, but for those of you who haven't heard it, the professional background that he has is very impressive. Sold 5 companies. His last company in December, and he's already working on his next startup. So he's really one of the truly remarkable entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley who has created lots of hundreds, millions of dollars of companies, very, very big, sizable companies, exited them. So like, if there's somebody that you can truly call a serial entrepreneur, he is one. But apart from that, I can say from many dinners that he's a very fun guy. Yesterday he resisted more drinks because he said he needs to wrap up the presentation, which I think was done about midnight or something like that. Because he said he doesn't want to give you a pitch about his company, but he wants to give you a generic pitch about his theories and some of the things that he's working on. So it's the first time that he's giving that presentation. So I think I really appreciate all of that effort. And he's going to talk about how to scale with all the new data regulations across all countries, which is a very, very important problem for all of us. So please welcome Peter Yared on stage and listen to some of his interesting theories. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks a lot. How's it going? Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, as Philip said, we're doing a more custom presentation here on scaling a business with all the new data regulations across countries. And this is a problem that's becoming, really intense even for US startups. We have massive scale in our own country. And so it's pretty typical for American companies to only focus on the US market and then try to work externally. But I'm sure you guys have clicked on links and noticed that, the internet is increasingly fragmenting. Hang on, let me see if I can hit next here. Whoops. Here we go. This is actually, yeah, as Philip said, I was adding content to this last night, and this is an article from yesterday, which says, the splinternet is here, and your company needs to be ready. And so the splinternet is sort of the facetious term people are using for the fact that the internet is increasingly fragmented. And what's interesting is that this used to be primarily, China, mainly, and then Russia to some extent. So in China, it was dubbed the Great Firewall. It's very difficult to access a lot of different websites. And this is a very well-known issue, so they were blocking Google and sites like that. It actually helped them build a nascent internet industry on their own, which is now a juggernaut. But it's very inopportune when you're traveling. And then I'm sure if you guys work with people in Russia, they're not on LinkedIn, So the internet has kind of split up, but it's not just Russia and China now. In Europe, of course, there's GDPR. In India, they just, passed a new law, and I travel a lot. So I was in Istanbul last November, and I clicked on a Wikipedia link. I couldn't load it. And in the US, we have this holiday called Thanksgiving, and the next day, because Americans are big consumers, there's a big shopping day where you can get big discounts. And I was actually in Taiwan, and I wanted this discount on a new washer-dryer. We needed a new washer-dryer. So I go to this site called HomeDepot.com, which is the largest home retailer in the US. I couldn't access the website. Basically, it's only accessible in the countries they operate in, which was Canada, America, and Mexico. And, a whole nother story, I was in Prague. I was working in Prague part-time for the last 5 years, and I see an article on Facebook or Twitter. I click it, can't access it because of GDPR. Then I try to buy a ticket from Southwest Airlines. They only serve their website in the countries that they operate in as well, just like Home Depot. So it's interesting, when you're in one place, you have your view of the internet. And you go somewhere else, and it's already Balkanized, if you will. I'm using a funny term because we're close to the Balkans. So this is something that's actively been happening for years, and is only just now really becoming, put into the consciousness after GDPR really hit in May. But what's interesting is this is just the consumer side. This is me as a consumer going to Taiwan, going to Prague, going to Taiwan, other countries, and trying to, use the internet as I ordinarily do without a VPN. And it's becoming to the point where most consumers, if they want their home internet experience, have to get a VPN. And this is not just because of content restrictions. But on the business side, there's a real driver for this stuff. And mainly it's because citizen data has been misused and breached and violated, and not a day goes by. And actually, there was another article last night. I didn't grab actually, it was this morning, so it's not in this presentation, but the US Immigration Service was breached, and everybody's photograph has been now leaked onto the internet. So if you got your ESTA visa and went to the US, you now have your photo breached, and somebody can image recognize it. So it's happening over and over again, worldwide. Companies that store data are not storing it in a secure way. And what's happening is that countries are starting to pass data residency laws. And what data residency laws means is the data has to be stored in the country. So this would be a law such as in Romania. It would say, hey, any data about a Romanian citizen has to be stored in Romania. And you go, well, why would anybody do this? It seems kind of silly. But the main reason is so that the legal jurisdiction for that data, for that citizen, is covered by that citizen's country. And this is why you're seeing more and more of these. And actually, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, just passed a law 4 weeks ago saying that all health data about UAE citizens has to be stored in the UAE. And then they followed up 3 weeks later, just a week ago, that says not only stored, also processed. And it's kind of ironic because, their sovereign fund there invested in Color Genomics, which is a very popular genomics company in the US. So I guess they saw firsthand that, this is what's happening to our data. Some company in America has all the genetic information of a bunch of our citizens. So they're starting to see this firsthand, and they're like, we don't even have access to it. And it's pretty much covered under US law, not under our law. So the idea is, put it in our country. The data is physically in our country. It's covered by our laws. But this really starts to add a lot of wrinkles, right? Because not only are these laws getting passed, now they're starting to get enforced. So if you have a business that's operating internationally, it's like, Russia went after, there's a big US company called Procter & Gamble. They make things like diapers, right? They don't like headlines like this, right? And, Vietnam passed the law. And actually, I should have grabbed a better headline, but in December, India passed the law, as I was mentioning, and TechCrunch had a very witty headline, which said that, India just ruined Walmart and Facebook's Christmas. Walmart and Amazon's Christmas, because they passed a law about how the e-commerce platforms had to store data, manage transactions, and they couldn't even build a product and sell it themselves anymore because it was deemed anti-competitive. So the point is, we've had companies, it used to be the Silicon Valley way. Uber would enter a market, and they'd say, our enemy is the taxi company. And I know you guys even had this in Cluj, because I was told by my Uber driver. But you're basically taking on a local taxi company and maybe a local government, right? And everyone kind of skirts the law. I can still get an Uber here, everyone's kind of, but and Uber scaled phenomenally. But then there was a company called Zenefits. And Zenefits tried to do the same thing for health insurance in the US. And they got creamed. And the reason for this is that health data and payment data and transaction data and employee data, this type of data is heavily regulated right now in every country. The way this type of data is handled has a ton of rules around it, and startups can't really mess in this area. It's not like, a corrupt taxi commission like we would have in San Francisco, where you had to buy a medallion and there was maybe 10 taxis in the entire city. And the thing about this is these data residency laws, they're in 30 countries and starting to expand, but the regulated data market is massive. The health data, employee data, transaction data, this type of data, every market you go into, it's highly regulated. And what's interesting about this is every country has their own laws, and what we're finding in countries like even the US, there's a separate law for California. In Germany, they have separate laws for various states on how to treat data. And so in America, we have a set of laws on how to handle payment and regulations on how to handle payment information. You can't just store a credit card anymore. You have to give it to somebody that is professionally set up to store a credit card number. But look at this complexity and multiply this by 190 countries, or depending on your definition, 205 countries, if you count like the Vatican and what have you. This is a very complicated way to operate, and you have to consider that these countries are increasingly fining. And this is why companies that are operating internationally are saying, hey, you know what, I'm Home Depot. I don't care if Peter Yared can't buy a washer dryer from Taiwan, because the lost business of that really doesn't matter to me versus having to deal with Taiwanese law. And this is the decision a lot of companies are making. So the experience you're having on the consumer side, is really getting impacted on the business side. And basically, you used to think that the internet was like this global thing and anybody could access it and do whatever they want. But what we're seeing is it's much more like a physical business now. McDonald's comes to every country in the world practically, and they set it up, and it kind of looks the same, but you walk in, the employees of McDonald's are paid under the laws of that country. The food matches the laws of that country and also the customs of that country. I was in Tokyo with my son actually, and he was like, I'm sick of eating raw fish, right? And let's go to McDonald's. And I was like, oh man, I don't want to go to McDonald's, but I went in there, I was hungry, I ordered hamburger. It was remarkably good because they have great laws in Japan about how meat should be treated. But what's interesting is you got to think of your internet business like a McDonald's franchise now. Everywhere you do business, you really have to think about what it's like to interact with consumers there, store data there, how you're going to, interact, how you're going to take a payment, what are you going to do with transaction data. And it's not as simple as it seems. You have something as simple as eye color. You're like, I'm going to make a new Tinder dating app, and I'm going to ask people for their eye color, their hair color, their height. They can put it into the profile. Well, guess what? In some countries, this is considered health data. So now you're expanding, you're a startup, you're jibbing and jibing. You're like, we're going to go to Costa Rica. And all of a sudden, you're storing people's health data, and you're exposing it to other people. And this is illegal. And this is just a simple use case. Imagine a Chinese citizen in China buys a plane ticket from Lufthansa.com. What do you do with the profile information, the payment information, the transaction information? It's an increasingly complicated type of framework because now it's transborder. It's not just the 200 countries. It's the 200 countries multiplied by 200 countries. And then you have the facets, profile information, transaction information, health information. So this is a three-dimensional matrix now where you have to go in and go, okay, what do I do in this situation? Maybe, you know what, I don't think this, it did go. Maybe you have to store the profile in China and the transaction information in Germany. Who knows anymore? I can't even answer this stuff. And what's interesting is be careful about the type of data you're storing now because, these laws are sometimes authoritarian. So when you're storing regulated information, and even in the US and most democracies, if the government has a good reason to look at credit card transactions or what have you, they're going to get that data, right? But then you have, you do have countries like Russia and China, but also Australia now says, I can look at anyone's text messages. I can look at your blog posts, even if they're hidden or private. So what I recommend is if you're running a website or an app, just don't store the stuff to the right. Why do you want to be the person that, I send you a text message and some government wants to look at it? Don't be in the middle of that, right? Focus on the type of data that if you store it and a government needs to look at it, mostly it's not a big deal. It's not somebody's private communications. So that would be a recommendation. And the thing about it is, how do you comply with one of these things, right? And you look at what multinational companies have to do, look at all the different teams. And I know some of you work with outsourcers, so I'm sure sometimes you're on these phone calls with like 30 people. And it's because it's not easy. You have to have the legal team tells you what to do. And so, you're moving into the Philippines, and it's this kind of data, so maybe you have to do this. Legal, the lawyers, they never tell you, black or white. It's always kind of in the middle. Then you have the compliance team, the information security team. If the data's only in that country, you probably want it in more than one facility, right? Because what if that facility goes offline? What if it just keels over? So anyway, there's a long, complicated thing. I didn't even put program management on that, somebody to make sure everyone's doing their jobs. But net, you want to have data residency in a particular market, it's a good 3 to 6 month process. So one way to kind of solve this problem, and people are already doing this. For example, you set up a website, and you have, you don't handle credit card payments yourself. You don't handle shipping yourself. Sometimes you don't even handle registration yourself. You can use Okta or Auth0. So one way to solve this problem is you outsource the headache. And everybody went through this with credit card numbers just 5, 6, 7 years ago, where you used to have a credit card number, you'd store it yourself, you'd send it to PayPal or whoever. Then you said, oh my gosh, I don't want to store these credit card numbers anymore. There's all these rules. I'm going to store the credit card number somewhere else and point to it. So one way to operate globally is there's a whole bunch of what I call global to local vendors that help you do everything, right? Transfer money, take a payment, shipping. So there's a company called Passport Shipping. There's all these new brands. They sell things like these Allbirds shoes. You can get these anywhere in the world because Passport Shipping will ship it to Romania, deal with the customs duties, hand it off to the local carrier, and boom, you get your shoes at a decent rate. And so it's interesting because this fragmented internet, in some ways it causes challenges, but in other ways it can make things a little, easier, that it forces you to use a bunch of vendors. If your engineers are like, I'm going to build everything myself, this kind of tips them over. And now I'm going to leave you guys with a thought, because it's actually not just the internet that is fragmenting and going local. The trend actually is deglobalization. And it's slowly happening everywhere. And you look at the technology trends behind this stuff, like automated manufacturing, 3D printing, vertical farming, lab-grown meat, clean energy. Fracking is a technology where you can extract oil out of the ground. We do it in the US now. In 10 years, we almost stopped importing oil. The US is now a net oil producer if you include petroleum products. And you look at these technologies, and you have to think that this idea that something would be made only in one place and then shipped all over the world is a temporary phenomenon. The idea that something's manufactured in China and shipped 7,000 miles to Long Beach in the US and then loaded on a truck and then driven over a mountain to Salt Lake City and then put on a shelf at Walmart, temporary. I was in Vietnam, I bought California pistachios. Then I was in Prague, I bought California pistachios. I mean, it's almost at the point where it's become ludicrous, although it's a reality that we all live in right now. And when you look at this set of technologies, the idea that if you need a part, and you look at it like a part for a car, a part for the speaker, or you need that table leg or that couch leg over there. So it used to be that there'd be a factory, they'd make a ton of these parts, and then they would send them all over the place so that if you went and got your car repaired, they'd be like, oh, we have your new tailpipe, you'll have your car today. And somebody went, having all this inventory everywhere, it's really expensive. We have to forecast, we have to make all these parts, we have to ship them everywhere, they're just sitting there. So somebody had the great idea, let's put all the parts in one place next to FedEx. Then when you bring your car in, they're like, you need a part, we're gonna have it for you tomorrow. They FedEx the part. So now they can keep all the parts for various cars in one place and drop ship them where they need to be, and that's where we are today. Now imagine that there's no parts, there's no warehouse, there's no airplanes. You drive in, they go, oh, you need a new part. We'll 3D print it for you. Now, even if that 3D printed part is 3 times as expensive to produce right now than a part that, was made, en masse in a factory, it's actually cheaper overall because you don't have to pre-produce a bunch of parts and forecast it and put it into a warehouse. All that inventory can go away. The airplanes flying everything around can go away. So this is a really fundamental shift of local production. And I actually think it's a very exciting kind of development. So there's some negatives to all of these, but there's also some real positives, all right? It's more efficient, it's clean, it's local. And time's up. Thank you very much.